Well, Jesse, thanks so much for jumping on with me to talk about some interesting news stories that we found this week that we want to share with the MSP community.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and for those watching this who don't know, my name is Mike Brooks. I am the Senior Director of Product Marketing here at Kaseya, and with Jesse Forrester, who is the Senior Solutions Specialist for Secure Payments.
Thanks again for having me, Mike.
And Jesse is, I'm like his wingman. So I'm going to be the wingman who's gonna feed some cool stuff. Jesse's like the big brain of secure payments. Jesse knows everything about all this stuff. And so I have a question. When the experts have questions, they come to Jesse. So I appreciate you doing this, Jesse. And I want to start off with this interesting story from a couple weeks ago, but it's really important example of what happens to merchants, the small businesses. So MSPs listening to this, these are your customers, and you, if you take credit cards, right? What happens to them when a credit card breach occurs? So I'm going to dive into this news story here and talk about it, and then I'm bring Jesse on to kind of fill in some blanks for me. Um, if you go to the show notes on this inside the YouTube channel, inside that description, we'll have links to all of these articles so you can see them. And, we're doing this because we want to bring this information to you so you can share it with your customers. This is really important. It's going to position you as a local expert, I'm sure you've been doing if you're watching something like this. You guys know the drill. So this happened in Chicago area. A local business lost $40,000 over the course of several weeks to a credit card scam. So the merchant took the credit card and it was approved by the bank. So obviously, you take a credit card, you think it's fine. What he learned the hard way, however, just because you get a credit card approval doesn't necessarily mean you're going to actually get your money. And I'd assume everyone else out there who takes credit cards also would probably assume when you put through a transaction and you get that approval status, that the money's going to come to you. So I'm going to read a little bit from this article for you, Jesse. The scammer made several orders for diesel fuel to be delivered by a third-party vendor over the course of a few weeks. It wasn't until nearly 3 weeks after the first transaction, and long after the fuel was long gone, did the merchant's bank remove the money from his account, which is known as a chargeback. And this is one of those things bad guys know. If they have access to payment credentials, they make as many transactions as they can as quickly as possible before they get reported, said digital security expert Peter Tapling of PTAP Advisory. Now, so this merchant thought he had an extra layer of protection by using the Authorize.net payment platform to process credit card transactions. And the article goes on that Authorize.net, which is a very popular merchant, we use them too, and we use them for our customers at Secure Payments, right? We might roll out Authorize.net if they come on board with Secure Payments. So we find this to be, this is not a scam merchant by any means.
Like it's owned by Visa.
Right. So they're very popular merchant. We use them, owned by Visa, as Jesse said, and advertises this advanced fraud detection to minimize risk to your business. And this is from the article directly, not me saying this, despite the fact that the word authorize is in the name of the company. An Authorize.net representative acknowledged it plays no role in actually authorizing transactions. The company said payments are authorized by the credit card's issuing bank. So his bank, Bank of America, has been unwilling to offset the merchant's losses. So some bad guy gets a hold of a credit card credentials, uses them fast because he knows the game. Then weeks later, this small business gets $40,000 in chargeback, and his bank's not going to help him. Bank of America spokesman said in an emailed statement that scams like these are a reminder to follow the merchant or payment platform instructions to avoid fraud or scams. Now, that sounds like a nice piece of advice after they charged back $40,000, of course. They offered tips to avoid fraudulent transactions. They include requiring all cardholder information such as address, expiration date, security code, as well as the use of an address verification system. Now, here's the end of the article, and this should freak merchants out a little bit. Before I kind of ask you my question here, Jesse, the final twist of this fuel theft fraud came when Listneck more thoroughly reviewed the driver's, that's the merchant. He more thoroughly reviewed the driver's license photo he required the customer to provide before fulfilling the order. The name matched the one on the credit card, but a Google image search later revealed the driver's license photo matched a man's image on the FBI's most wanted list. Fernando Grijalva, I'm pronouncing the name wrong, I'm sure, is wanted for allegedly embezzling more than $3 million while working for a company in Boca Raton, Florida. There's no indication that this person was actually involved in the credit card scam, according to a law enforcement source. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, Jesse. Let me ask you a couple of questions about this. So first of all, I don't see in this article a lot about what exactly the merchant did wrong here, right? Other than not Googling the driver's license image. I mean, that sounds insane to me. Can we assume this could have been mitigated if the merchant did a few missing things, or is this over the top?
Well, this could be one of a number of things that happened, Mike. Chargebacks are a very common occurrence for businesses, and many of the people watching have experienced a chargeback. Let's start by what is a chargeback. That is when you're disputing a transaction that happened, saying that you didn't authorize the transaction or this transaction wasn't initiated properly. So while Authorize.net does an incredible job of keeping customers' data secure, there's also merchant responsibilities. And big processors, big providers like Authorize.net can usurp the responsibilities by putting the onus on the merchant, right? It's your responsibility to validate whether these transactions are legit or not. And while that can be difficult at times, there's certain things that you must do to ensure that those transactions are secure. But to take it a step further, this chargeback scam dates back to about 2006 when PCI compliance came about. PCI compliance is a way for the card brands, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover, to not only ensure that the platforms like Authorize.net are following certain guidelines. Most common is those EMV chip cards that came around in about 2012, as well as encrypting the data that enters and leaves the network of the merchant, where they X out the credit card numbers, but also puts the onus and responsibility on the merchant to be following best practices. And what the scammers understand is that 73%, or almost 3/4 of businesses, are PCI non-compliant. When you're PCI non-compliant, you do not get to fight chargebacks, regardless of whether or not that transaction was authorized properly or not. So a couple things could have happened here. One is they didn't validate the identification of the payer, but more likely they were non-compliant because they didn't complete their merchant responsibilities to ensure that they were transmitting that data properly. And that is answering a series of questions about the way you're taking transactions. And the scammers know this. It's very easy for them to go buy credentials and steal the identity of another person and use that information to make fraudulent transactions. And they know that there's no way for 3/4 of merchants to fight this transaction when it happens. So a couple of things could have happened here, Mike.
So, I see credit card commercials all the time. You can't watch TV for more than 5 seconds without seeing a credit card commercial. And it's not lost on me that as a consumer, I can go out and charge with, and have this credit card do whatever I want. And, if I look at my credit card statement and there's one of these fraud charges, they're just going to take it off my card and reimburse me. But as a merchant, you have so much more. You have to think about it. It's, the what's in your wallet thing, right? So now what happens now to this guy? I mean, he got charged back, right? But other than that, how does this affect going forward? Like if I miss a credit card payment enough times, my credit score goes down, right? Maybe my interest rate goes up. What are the repercussions on the merchants because of this?
Well, you have to remember that there's also business credit, right? And business credit is very similar to your personal credit. When you have enough chargebacks or too many chargebacks, the credit card processors look at you as a risk, right? And a couple things can happen. One, you can be blacklisted from accepting credit cards in general altogether. Another thing is you can be put into a high risk category where your credit card processing fees skyrocket up to above 10% per transaction. The average credit card processor charges around 3% for a regular traditional credit card processing account. But if you're not following best practices and you're not validating transactions properly, you could be charging upwards of 10% for each transaction. And that's very difficult for businesses to mitigate the cost of that. There's other fines and fees that are associated with breaches as well. So when there is a breach, there's an arbitration period, and the card brands will charge somewhere between $5,000 and $100,000 per month for these breach arbitrations, right? And that takes a couple months at a time. So at the very least, a customer will be charged $10,000 for a breach because they didn't follow best practices and they didn't do what they're responsible for.
Very interesting.
Mhm.
So now what's next for a guy like this? Like, what would your recommendation for him to do? I mean, he's got some issues now, right? That money's gone. He's never going to get that back, right? But what how does this affect him going forward? So
Well,
what should he do? What would you recommend?
I would say the first thing that you can do to protect yourself against chargebacks is make sure that you're PCI compliant. If you're not PCI compliant, there's no way to fight the chargeback. When you have a chargeback, the first thing the card brands, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover do is check to see if you're PCI compliant. And remember, I said a few minutes ago, 3/4 of merchants are non-compliant, right? So it's very easy for the credit card company to not have to honor that transaction if you're not following best practices. So my recommendation would be to reach out to your processor and ask them for a physical attestation of compliance. That's a physical document showing that you did all the steps that you're supposed to do to become compliant. If you do not have that, you are not considered PCI compliant. No matter what anybody says. There's a couple of steps that you need to take. In some cases, you need to scan your network and make sure that there's network security in place. But in all cases, you have to self-assess your environment and attest to the fact that you're not doing things like writing down credit card numbers, not checking identification, not taking certain information about the transaction, and not validating the transaction ahead of time. So that's the first step. The second step is you do have the ability, if you are PCI compliant, to arbitrate against that chargeback. Keeping records is very, very important. Keeping records of the invoices, of the work orders, of the email correspondence that you have, of the validation with the bank. And if you're able to provide that, there's a high likelihood that they will honor that chargeback and protect you as the merchant. The card brands are there to protect you, but only if you follow their recommendations and requirements.
Very interesting. Okay, last question on this one, Jesse. Then we'll move on to our next news story. How can an MSP use this story to educate their customer base? Likely, this merchant is probably some MSP's customer.
Mm-hmm.
What should the MSP have done? His MSP should have done, and how can our audience share this story to educate their customers?
One thing MSPs can do is align with a company who can validate PCI compliance for your customers. Network security is important. MSPs are very good at that, but there's also the merchant requirements, which are ever changing and a little bit murky in some cases. So if you can align with a vendor who can handle PCI compliance, such as a qualified assessor for your customers, that would be the first step in protecting your customers. Another misconception is most small businesses assume that they're not the target. People are going after Lowe's and Home Depot and these big major corporations. And the reality is one of the biggest targets are nonprofits. Because the bad guys know that they don't have systems in place to protect themselves against things like chargebacks. So to educate your customers on the fact that the risks are all around you, and this isn't some hacker in somebody's basement. This is usually a college kid who buys something off the dark web to run a bot on your system, and they target a small business that they know isn't being monitored or doing things like tracking IP addresses.
Yeah, and obviously this is a local story here. We didn't normally you don't see these things. We scour for these kind of things, but this is a very local story, so it didn't make the national news. But our next story did, and if you've been paying attention the past few weeks, you've probably heard that Ticketmaster experienced a little data breach, and this happened the same day a mutual friend of ours bought Rangers playoff tickets on Ticketmaster. I remember being on the phone with him when he was purchasing them, and it was the same day that hack happened. So hopefully he doesn't experience anything. And I'm not going to go into detail about my love or hate of Ticketmaster. I'll just say that, boy, it used to be easier to buy tickets and have a good time at concerts when I was younger. So the U.S. Justice Department filed an antitrust lawsuit against the ticketing conglomerate, that's hard to say. DOJ is seeking to break up the alleged monopoly its parent company, Live Nation Entertainment, holds over the live music and entertainment industry, potentially a good thing for the consumers. So the antitrust thing was already on plaguing them. And then hackers allegedly now stole customer information, right? Partial payment data, which includes names, the last four digits of the credit card number, and card expiration dates. But only affects 500 million users, right? The lawsuit, a lawsuit was filed last week, or well, as this article is a week old now, a couple of weeks ago against Live Nation and Ticketmaster, accusing the companies of negligence in allowing a third party company to gain access to private customer information belonging to 500 million with a B customers. Jesse, what does a hack like that mean for a company like Ticketmaster?
We have to understand that the bad guys will exploit any weaknesses they can. And a lot of times businesses with the ever-changing requirements for data protection aren't staying up to date on the newest hacks and the newest threats. And because of that, this customer data can be accessed easily and used downstream to impact other business areas. You have to remember that this came about in about 2012 when there was a Target breach. 40 million people got their credit card information stolen from Target. And at the time, Target was doing something brilliant, something that my wife takes advantage of all the time. They were developing their Cartwheel app, right? We have 6 children, and every time my wife bought size 5 diapers, Target would know that. So they would feed her relevant ads based on how often she bought things. Unfortunately, they're also passing the entire credit card information across an open network as well. And it took a young person about 5 minutes to figure out that they had access to millions of people's credit card information. And while Target was doing a good thing by developing this application, they weren't taking steps to keep customer data protected, which is why they decided to require point-to-point encryption, right? That's where they X out all the credit card numbers as they come in and go out. Right. Now, there's still data that's transitioned or transferred, even when that information is protected, but these bad guys will gather information from as many places as they can. A common hack for PayPal is credential stuffing. You can go onto the dark web and you can buy 10,000 stolen credentials for a little over $100. And you can also buy a bot for $90 and run it on a nonprofit's online bill pay link and get a copy of the 100 or so credentials that are still live, and you can exploit their information. It's very difficult to stay ahead of these hackers, and that's why these regulations are constantly changing. And when you're as big as Ticketmaster, it takes a lot of time and effort to make these changes. And again, the hackers exploit that weakness in the fact that they know that it takes them time and in money to figure this out. And many of these businesses aren't staying up to date. So it's not just Ticketmaster, it's many corporations. And they gather information from all over the place to try to exploit what they can, and they get little breadcrumbs at a time. And before you know it, they have your entire social security number, your information, your account number, your routing number, your credit card numbers, and they can go and resell that on the dark web, and which is probably what happened with the previous story, where he bought credentials and stole somebody's identity to take those diesel payments.
Wow. Now, Ticketmaster's a big company, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, they have an army of lawyers and other tools to mitigate their exposure. But imagine, like, let's translate this to what happens to the local business this happens to. Let's say this same thing happened to a local car dealership.
Mm-hmm. They're not going to have the resources to put in place to fight against that. I'll give you an example. I worked with a CPA firm. The CPA firm, we were reviewing their merchant processing statements, and one of the months, their processing fees went up about $1,300. And that was very out of the ordinary. And the CPA firm just assumed that they jacked their credit card rates. Credit card companies do that all the time, and they continued processing. Well, upon further inspection, we identified that there was a skimming or a card stuffing fraud on their account, where, again, I mentioned this before, somebody had bought credentials off the dark web for millions of stolen, tens of thousands of stolen credit card numbers, and they ran a bot to find out who still had money on their account and which accounts were still open. And they got a report back of all the cards that were still viable, and they went and repackaged those and sold it, and probably made about $950 on that scam, right? And the result was the CPA firm was stuck with payment authorization charges that stem back months and months and months, and they didn't even know about it. They weren't measuring the IP address on the online bill pay link that they used to accept payments for their CPA firm, and they were victim of a fraud that was ongoing because nobody ever caught it until we found it.
Goodness. And you mentioned credential stuffing before. I want to share another, this is not a news story, but just for some content that people can learn more about credential stuffing. Um, my basic understanding here, and you talked about it before, to put it simply, Jesse, is this: a cyber attack in which criminals attempt to access user accounts using stolen or leaked usernames and passwords, credentials, by trying them on multiple login pages and forms. So apparently, Zoom, Nintendo, GoDaddy, Marriott were all victims of credential stuffing attacks last year, I believe it was.
Mhm.
The article stated it did significant economic and reputation damage. Jesse, can you give us, again, go back into that, maybe dig deeper into what that credential stuffing is, and especially what does our local business, it's easy to look at these and, Zoom, Nintendo, GoDaddy, right? These are just huge companies. I want you to put it in relation to that small business who may have this happen to them. How can it happen to them? What is it?
Well, anecdotally, my son was one of those people who got his credentials stolen from his Nintendo account, and my
Wow.
debit card was exposed. He buys V-Bucks on Nintendo, and because of that, we had our credit card number saved on it, and we were one of those victims, unfortunately. And I'm an expert in this space,
Wow.
so you don't have a whole lot of control over that, and that happens downstream as well to smaller businesses where you have a PayPal link, a PayPal donation link on your website. Well, it's very easy for hackers to gather information and stolen PayPal credentials and go to your donation page and run this scam on you. And you're stuck with the payment authorization fees, and the bad guy gets away with all of the active credentials that are still valid and viable.
Unbelievable. And how can this affect a small business, or is this something small businesses don't have to worry about?
Of course, that's considered a breach, right? So when you're breached and you're not considered PCI compliant, for example, you face fines of $5,000 per instance. Imagine if there was hundreds of instances of this fraud that happened to your account, and when they go to arbitrate and find that you're not compliant in following best practices, you're not measuring IP addresses, and you're stuck with that arbitration cost and those fines, right? And nobody really talks to small businesses about this stuff. A small business assumes, a nonprofit assumes PayPal's a big company. They're secure, it's easy, it's convenient for us to use. They're going to keep me safe. Therefore, I'm going to choose them as my processor. And they don't have the resources to put in place to really understand some of the risks that are associated with having these things. They just want to get paid. This could shut a business down.
100%. What's a solution secure payments can help with? Because I know we have, like, if they had secure payments, how would that have helped mitigate this?
Great question. So we have a team of experts who align with the customer, the downstream customer of MSPs, and we look at the landscape and help them identify vulnerabilities. I mentioned a couple times in this conversation that measuring the IP addresses by which the donors or the people who are paying online bill pay links could protect you against these credential stuffing attacks. And what that does is it costs a penny per transaction, so it's not a huge cost for any size business to actually measure the IP address of where the donation or the payment is coming from. And if there's more than 5 or 4 or 3 attempts from one single IP address, it shuts down your donation page for the day. This is a very simple, effective way to avoid fraud. So our team of experts will go in and do a high-level layman's terms assessment with your customers. We'll help them look at the landscape and identify where the vulnerabilities are, and we'll work in coordination with the MSP to help remediate any of the issues that we come across. We also make recommendations for more secure environments. For example, if a nonprofit is using PayPal, we make recommendations to use a federally backed insured merchant processor that works very similarly to PayPal, that can help protect them against breach and chargeback mitigation. Not only that, but our team also helps your customers identify erroneous fees and things that are happening in their account that shouldn't be there. And we help to get rid of those fees by making recommendations to enter cards a little bit differently, to follow best practices, and to use functionality and integration to your benefit.
Awesome stuff. And just to kind of wrap this up, obviously, anybody listening to this, if you want to understand more about payment security, PCI compliance, Jesse is the person you need to talk to. So, Jesse, how can folks get in touch with you?
We can put my Calendly link in the page. You could email me at jesse.forster@securepayments.com, or you could call me at 701-331-0038.
Good deal. And make sure to listen again for future episodes where we bring you news stories, things that are going on out there that have to do with payment security. And Jesse's going to basically share with you what it all means and how you guys can go out and use this to become the expert in PCI compliance in your market.
Thank you, Mike.